Captain Nathan Walker and Lieutenant Commander Ben Anderson had been selected for this mission because of their previous experience. Walker was a veteran of several space operations, having assisted with Apollo 11's mission planning before being sidelined for various political reasons. Anderson, on the other hand, was younger, eager, and hungry for discovery. Both were extraordinary astronauts, but neither was prepared for what awaited them. They boarded the Liberty, the command module that would stay in orbit, while Walker and Anderson descended in the lunar module, Eagle's Shadow. The mission's directive was simple enough on paper: land on the moon, perform a set of geological surveys, and investigate an odd signal detected by a satellite probe several months earlier. The data indicated strange seismic activity in a remote section of the moon, but nothing that would set off alarms. There were whispers among the crew members about the real purpose of the mission, but no one spoke openly about it. The lunar module detached from Liberty and began its descent toward the moon. The sight of the barren, lifeless surface growing larger and larger in their viewports made Anderson's stomach flip. The deep gray landscape stretched endlessly, with jagged craters and towering ridges punctuating the otherwise flat expanse. The moon was so still, so quiet. It felt like a place that time had forgotten. There was something unnerving about the dead silence of it all. As the module descended, Walker kept his focus on the instruments, adjusting their speed and angle as they neared their landing site. But Anderson's eyes remained fixed on the horizon, where the dark shape of the lunar landscape seemed to shift in ways that didn't seem natural. A sliver of doubt crept into his mind, but he shook it off. They had a job to do. With a soft thud, the Eagle's Shadow landed on the moon's surface. The dust settled around them in the vacuum, leaving a faint trail of disturbance. The moment of landing was supposed to be one of triumph, but to Anderson, it felt like an omen. The silence outside the ship was deafening, a reminder of their isolation in the vast emptiness of space.
"We're here,"
Walker said, his voice steady. He sounded like a man used to moments like this. Anderson, however, couldn't shake the feeling that they were intruding on something far older and far more dangerous than they could imagine. They donned their suits, securing helmets and oxygen tanks, and sealed themselves in the airlock. The hatch opened and they stepped out onto the moon's surface.
"I'll take point,"
Walker instructed, leading the way as Anderson followed. The moon's gravity was light, making their movements slow and deliberate, as if the world itself was trying to delay them. They climbed into the lunar rover, a bulky vehicle designed for traversing the rough terrain, and began their journey to the anomaly. The ride was smooth enough, but there was a pervasive unease that both men couldn't shake. Anderson noticed how everything seemed off. The way the shadows stretched unnaturally long, the way the surface of the moon rippled beneath them, as though the dust was shifting in subtle ways that didn't align with physics. But he didn't say anything. The moon stretched endlessly before them, and the sound of their rover's engines was the only thing that cut through the silence. That is, until they approached the formation. The anomaly was something neither astronaut had expected to find. It wasn't just an unusual geological formation as they had been led to believe. There was a strange metallic gleam to the rocks that defied logic. The signal that had been picked up earlier had originated here. But it wasn't coming from any technology they recognized. It felt alive. As they neared the formation, the rover's sensors began to pick up increasingly erratic readings. Strange vibrations thrummed through the ground beneath them, faint at first, then gradually stronger, like the pulse of something massive and hidden just below the surface.
"That's not normal,"
Anderson muttered.
"These readings are all wrong."
Walker's face hardened. He flicked switches on his control panel, trying to stabilize the rover's systems.
"We need to check this out."
The rover's tires crunched across the gray dust as they approached the formation. The strange metallic structure, or whatever it was, loomed larger. It was as if the ground itself had been disturbed. The rock seemed to pulse, as though it had a heartbeat. Suddenly the ground trembled violently, throwing the rover off course. Anderson's breath caught in his throat as a series of sharp, piercing screeches echoed through their comms.
"What the
Walker began, but his words were cut off as the lunar surface cracked open beneath them. A dark, oily substance oozed up from the cracks, and from it emerged something far worse. Creatures. Strange, grotesque forms with elongated limbs and spindly fingers that twitched like spiders. They were covered in dark, viscous goo that seemed to move and shimmer in the light of the sun. Their bodies were thin, their skeletal frames barely holding them together. Their eyes, black and cold, blinked unnervingly as they scanned the two astronauts. Anderson's voice was shaking now.
What are they?
Walker gripped the controls of the rover, his eyes wide in disbelief.
We need to get back to the module, now!
The rover sped off, the creatures following in quick pursuit. They moved with unnatural speed, their limbs scuttling across the moon's surface like insects, too fast to be natural. A sinking feeling crawled up Anderson's spine. The fear in Walker's eyes matched his own.
Don't stop!
They raced toward the lunar module, but the creatures were getting closer, their sharp screeches echoing in the void. Anderson's hands trembled on the controls as they neared the module, the hatch now in sight. They had to make it. If they didn't... With a final burst of speed, the rover came to a halt at the module. The two astronauts scrambled out of the vehicle and bolted for the hatch. The creatures reached the landing pad just as the door to the module sealed behind them. They were trapped. Inside the module, the atmosphere was tense. The pressure was rising. Walker and Anderson were breathing heavily, their suits creaking as they stripped them off, the airlock releasing a low hiss as the pressure equalized. Anderson's eyes were wide with terror.
Walker, what the hell were those things? What did we just see? I don't know. But whatever they are, they aren't just creatures. They're alive, and they've been here far longer than us.
The creature's presence wasn't just a passing threat. There was a sense of intent behind their movements, a malevolent intelligence that had been watching the astronauts from the moment they landed. Walker moved quickly to the communications panel, but as he flicked switches and pulled levers, the panel emitted nothing but static. The signal was dead. There was no link back to Liberty, no way to warn Earth, no way to call for help. And then the vibrations began again, but this time they were stronger, almost as if the moon itself was shaking. Anderson stumbled back, his face paling.
Walker, something's not right. This isn't just about the creatures.
Anderson broke off, his eyes narrowing at the screen in front of him. The instruments were flickering, reading erratically. Something was shifting beneath the surface of the moon, moving toward them. And they weren't alone. The creatures had never left. They were circling the module now, their screeches growing louder and more aggressive. Outside the module, the pounding began, sharp, quick raps against the metal like claws scraping against the hull. They were waiting. The moon went silent again almost as quickly as the pounding and scraping began. But for Walker and Anderson, the silence was suffocating. It felt as though the vast expanse of emptiness outside their small capsule was closing in on them. They could hear their own breathing, ragged and fast, the sound of their hearts hammering in their chests as they tried to hold on to any sliver of sanity. But it was slipping through their fingers, just like the broken communications link that had once connected them to Earth. Walker moved from station to station in the cramped confines of the lunar module. His hands were shaking as he tried every switch, every dial, every lever. He pounded the side of the control panel, willing it to work, but the instruments remained silent, the screens flickering sporadically. Static hummed from the speakers.
Damn it,
Walker muttered, his voice raw with frustration. Anderson was pacing in the opposite corner, his movements quick and erratic. He stopped for a moment and grabbed a clipboard off the table, clutching it like a lifeline.
Walker, we can't stay here. We have no way of contacting anyone. We have no way of getting off the moon.
The words hit Walker like a punch to the gut. He hadn't said it aloud, but he had been thinking it too. It was one thing to think they were stuck. It was another to say it aloud, to acknowledge the impossibility of their situation.
We'll figure something out,
Walker said, but there was no conviction in his voice. He could feel his composure starting to crumble. Anderson stopped pacing and turned to him, eyes wide with panic.
We're not going to make it, are we?
Walker didn't respond. He didn't know what to say. The truth was they were more likely to die here than survive. There was no rescue coming. No one was even looking for them. Earth was too far away, and their communications were too damaged. The world had moved on without them. unaware that its astronauts were about to become part of something far darker than any of them had ever imagined. The tremors began again. This time, they were stronger. The moon seemed to vibrate beneath their feet, as though the very ground was alive. Walker's head snapped up. The strange, pulsating vibrations had started again, but this time they weren't just felt beneath their feet. They were in the air, in the walls, in the very air they breathed. The steady hum of the life support system wasn't enough to drown out the growing noise.
"It's them,"
Anderson whispered, staring at the walls of the module, his eyes wide. His voice was barely audible, but the dread in his tone was clear. Walker's eyes darted toward the window. In the pale light of the distant sun, he could see the faint outlines of the creatures, moving around the lunar module in an unnatural pattern. They were circling them, testing them, as if trying to figure out how to tear the module apart.
"God, they're getting closer."
I know. We need to seal the hatch. We need to stay sealed in here.
Anderson nodded, but his gaze was distant. The walls felt like they were closing in. He couldn't help but picture the creatures outside, their pale, elongated limbs scuttling over the surface of the moon, making their way toward the module. Their gleaming black eyes fixed on him, on Walker, on everything. He stepped back toward the rear of the module, where the small emergency storage was located. A cold sweat trickled down his back, the pressure building in his chest. His breaths were coming quicker now, more shallow. The thin oxygen supply in the module only made him more aware of the isolation, the smallness of the space.
"Walker, we need to think. We need a plan now."
Anderson's voice was more forceful now, laced with desperation. He turned to Walker, eyes flicking between his friend and the view outside the window. Walker didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for a clipboard, scribbling frantically. He was searching for some kind of solution, anything, but there was nothing. Their training hadn't prepared them for this. No contingency for this, not a chance for survival. There was only a single route: rescue. But the probability of rescue was rapidly diminishing. The longer they waited, the more the creatures outside gathered, and with each passing moment, the creatures seemed to grow bolder, as if they knew they had them cornered. The sound of scraping claws against the metal became louder. The metal walls began to bend inwards. With each terrible sound, they drew closer. Walker gripped the clipboard in his hands, his knuckles white.
I'm trying, but there's no way to fix this.
Anderson's thoughts raced. He began to pace again, his movements frantic. There has to be something we can do. That's when the voice came through. It was faint, broken, distorted, but it was undeniably a voice. A voice they both recognized.
"Mission terminated. Abort. You need to leave now."
The transmission was barely audible, but it was enough to break through their despair, enough to freeze them both in place. They turned toward the communications panel, staring in disbelief as the static swirled into silence.
"What? Was that who I think it is?"
Walker felt a cold shiver run down his spine. It can't be, he thought, but he couldn't finish the thought, because he knew it was. It was from Earth. But who was still out there to be sending that? There should have been no one left to communicate with them.
"Abort? There's nothing to abort. What's happening?"
Walker's gaze dropped to the ground. He felt sick, the weight of everything crashing down on him. They're alone. No one is coming. Nothing can save them. The fear in his chest roared. And then the creaking began again. The metal walls of the lunar module began to groan under the weight of something heavy, something trying to force its way inside. Anderson grabbed Walker's arm. His face was pale, eyes wide with terror.
"Walker, no. They're finally getting in."
The final moment arrived faster than either of them could have imagined. The cold reality set in. This wasn't just a nightmare they could wake up from. There was no escape. There was no help. There was only the slow, inexorable advance of the creatures outside, their inhuman screeches reverberating through the walls of the lunar module. Walker's heart raced as he turned to the control panel, futilely trying to make the ship respond. But the systems were fried. Their comms were down. The power was dwindling. And the creatures, they were still out there, scratching and clawing, trying to breach the module.
"Walker, what do we do now? What can we do?"
Walker opened his mouth to speak, But nothing came out. He wanted to reassure Anderson, to promise him that they would find a way out. But the truth was, there was no hope. They were trapped. The creatures had seen them. They were not just out there anymore. They were inside the module, waiting for the right moment to strike. The metal door to the rear hatch rattled violently. Anderson let out a breathless scream as the metal bent outward, the pressure from the creature's relentless assault bending the module's walls in ways they should never have been able to.
They'll break through. We need to do something.
But there was nothing left to do. They were utterly powerless. All they could do was wait for the inevitable. And then another voice broke through the static on the comms. But this time, it wasn't from Earth. The voice was dark, distorted, and far too familiar.
We've been watching you for so long.
Walker's blood turned to ice. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even close. It was alien, guttural, and horrifying, like the growls of something that had been living beneath the moon for centuries. The creatures outside seemed to grow agitated, their screeches rising in intensity. They were responding to the voice, responding to the words. The communication system sputtered and crackled, but it continued.
You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have disturbed us.
The communication system erupted into a short concert of sparks and made a high-pitched whirring sound, which attracted every creature to their location. The creatures, no longer held at bay by the fragile walls of the lunar module, tore into the hatch. But just as they did so, instead of the sparks signifying the system's demise, Anderson and Walker realized what had just happened. The creatures were not destroying, they were rewiring. The cheerful navigation system spoke up.
Destination set, Earth. Time until arrival, 3 days, 11 hours, and 14 minutes.
The thrusters ignited.
Oh no.
Oh no.
But it was too late. They exchanged quick glances with the same thought in mind. What will happen if these things get to Earth? The final moments were a blur of terror. The creatures overwhelmed them, their claws slashing through the air, their jaws snapping. Anderson and Walker screamed one last time as the creatures closed in. And then, everything went black.